Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for choosing to spend your Wednesday afternoon with DECL. So we're starting now as most of the registrants are coming in. So my name is Max, and this webinar is entitled To Seek DECL Critics in Conversation. We have a power lineup today. So I am personally excited. We've already spoken to the panelists early on. This is the second in a series of online roundtable discussions that feature DECL's most eminent alumni in celebration of the department's 111th founding anniversary. To formally start this webinar, I'd like to call the DECL Chair, Dr. Judy Celine Ick, for our welcome remarks.
Hello, welcome everybody, and thank you for coming to Seek. This is, as Maxine said, the second in a series of webinars celebrating 111 years of the DECL's history. The DECL is one of the oldest departments in the University of the Philippines and one with the most long-running program in English studies, creative writing, and comparative literature and English language. And as Max says, we had a power lineup for you today. Of course, we've trained more than 3 critics, we'd like to think. But here are 3 of our very best, and I hope you enjoy their discussion this afternoon. Thank you very much and welcome.
Thank you, Ma'am Judy. All right. Before we go to the main event, let's talk a little bit about the mechanics of this webinar. Here's a quick overview of what's going to happen this afternoon. Our moderator, Dr. Pison, who I will introduce later on, will be giving out prompts to facilitate the 1-hour roundtable discussion among our speakers. As the discussion is happening, audience members are encouraged to ask questions via the Q&A button at the bottom middle part of your Zoom screen. I'll repeat that, the Q&A button at the bottom middle part of your Zoom screen. After the RTD or the roundtable discussion, there will be an open forum in which our speakers will be answering your questions, right? We also have team members who will vet the questions as well. Speaking of moderator, she is also part of the power lineup we have today. I'd like to introduce Dr. Ruth Jordana L. Pison. So Ma'am Ruth, as we fondly call her in the department, teaches Philippine literature and critical theory at the Department of English and Comparative Literature of the College of Arts and Letters in UP Diliman. Her works on Philippine novels were published by the UP Press, and her essays on dance and literature are included in various journals, anthologies, and collections. Together with Patrick Alcedo, she co-edited Narrativizing Dancing Bodies, published in 2019, a special issue of UP's DECL. She was assistant editor of the second edition of the dance volume of the CCP Encyclopedia of Philippine Arts, and currently a co-editor of its online version. Last January 2021, she joined the editorial staff of Humanities Diliman as editor-in-chief. Ladies and gentlemen, this is Ma'am Ruth, Dr. Ruth Jordana Pison. Hi, Ma'am Ruth.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Max. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this afternoon's roundtable discussion with 3 of our favorite scholars. I'm sure most of our participants this afternoon have read their works, listened to their lectures, or have watched them on YouTube. Let me now introduce our critics. All of them have been part of our department, and matalik natin silang mga kaibigan na hanggang ngayon kasama natin. So our first speaker is Professor Ruanni Tupas. We call him Topsy, batchmates namin ng ibang mga members of the department. He teaches social linguistics in education at the Institute of Education, University College, London. He obtained his BA and MA from the Department of English and Comparative Literature of UP Diliman and his PhD from the National University of Singapore. He authored Second Language Teaching, edited Remaking Society, The Politics of Language, Discourse, and the Identity of the Philippines, and Unequal Englishes, The Politics of Englishes Today. Some of his co-edited works are Language, Education, and Nation Building, Assimilation and Shift in Southeast Asia, Why English? Confronting the Hydra, and Bloomsbury World Englishes Volume 2, Ideologies. He has also written articles published in international journals such as World English's International Journal of Bilingual Education and Bilingualism, and Journal of Multilingual and Multicultural Development. He is currently an associate editor of the International Journal of the Sociology of Language. In the past months, he has engaged in discussions of Pinoy pop from a linguistics and social linguistics perspective. I'm sure some of you have seen him on YouTube. No? He's been analyzing yung mga videos of Alamat. Our second speaker, Ma'am Lily Rose Tope, is a professorial lecturer at the Department of English and Comparative Literature, where she served as chair from 2012 to 2020. She obtained her BA and MA in Comparative Literature and her PhD from the National University of Singapore. A teacher and scholar for 43 years, she is the author of Unframing Southeast Asia, Nationalism and the Post-Colonial Text in English in Singapore, Malaysia, and the Philippines, as well as several articles on Southeast Asian literature in English, Philippine Chinese literature, and ethnicity in Southeast Asian literature. Our third guest speaker, or third discussant, is Professor Caroline Hau. She's professor at the Center for Southeast Asian Studies, Kyoto University. She obtained her BA in English Studies from the University of the Philippines, Diliman, and her MA and PhD from Cornell University. She is the author of Necessary Fictions, Philippine Literature and the Nation 1946 to 1980. On the subject of the nation, Filipino Writings from the Margins 1981 to 2004. The Chinese Question, Ethnicity, Nation, and Region in and Beyond the Philippines. Elites and Ilustrados in Philippine Culture, and Interpreting Rizal. Her co-edited books include Querida and Elite with Isabelita Reyes and Katrina Tuvera, Traveling Nation Makers, Transnational Flows and Movements in the Making of Southeast Asia with Kasian Tejapira, and Remembering Rethinking EDSA with J.P. Manzanilla, another English major. As a fictionist, she has published 2 collections of short stories, Recuerdos de Patay and Other Stories, and Demigods and Monster, and a novel entitled Tiempo Muerto. In 2021, she received the Grant Goodman Prize in Historical Studies. So all of our speakers this afternoon will be addressing the following questions from their respective fields of expertise. How critical is the state of Philippine critical studies? Where has it gone, and where has it yet to go? What newer world should the Filipino critic seek? And how does English, as both linguistic medium and part of our colonial history, inform our critical practice? So now let's listen to our first speaker, Professor Tupas. Thank you.
Maraming salamat, Blackmate.
Salamat din, Black. Your turn.
Okay. Thank you very much, Ruth, for the introduction. At maraming salamat din po sa Department, Judy, and the rest of the faculty for the invitation. And also, I'm definitely not just glad, but honored and privileged to be part of this panel with Ma'am Tope and Carol. So I actually requested Ruth that I speak first because I want to listen to the other speakers intently because I'm sure I will be learning so much from them. Okay, so in the limited time that I'm given, when I was actually sent the questions, I'm in a sense kind of excited about these questions because these are questions that usually don't get to linguists. Linguistics doesn't really figure quite centrally in questions regarding criticality and critical studies. I mean, of course, there are questions that we engage in this, but in terms of the general conversations around this, linguistics usually doesn't become the first, go-to discipline to answer these questions. Language, of course, as a topic, yes, but not linguistics as a discipline. In a sense, it's understandable. I would like to say so because I think the epistemological beginnings and foundations of linguistics have, to a large extent, been very, very structuralist, very contextualized. The focus has been on, the study of language as system, the study of language as a structure. And therefore, there was, engaging with these kinds of questions require a different range of, theoretical perspectives and theoretical lenses as well. being an undergrad, for example, in the DECL, and even teaching in the DCL, personally, I was always asking myself questions about how is my linguistics able to explain myself, to illuminate my own experience as a multilingual language speaker, for example. And at the time, and even now, actually, it still is a struggle to be able to do that. Nevertheless, I think it's also a misconception, to think of linguistics as in very homogeneous ways, because even within this broad field of language studies, there has been a struggle. In fact, I would say massive contestations over what counts as linguistics to start with, and what counts, and because of that, in terms of what counts as language to start with, because of the implications of our definitions of what language is in the first place. A lot of talk about how language is an invention, and therefore you have Pennycook, for example, and Makoni basically talking about the disinventing, or the disinvention of language, to be able to unpack language as something that is constructed, because on the ground what you have is actually really not language the way we think of it, but language in terms of overlapping linguistic and semiotic meaning practices. And so if you have that, not English or Aklanon, which is my mother tongue and not Tagalog, what are the implications of these when we are actually linked language with national identity, for example? So these are questions that are really very much a part of the discussions in the field as well. And it is here where emerge, these questions about critical or criticality in the field as well. So to cut the story short, I think broadly speaking, when we're talking about critical language work, we're talking basically of looking at language or locating language in its broadest embeddedness in society and history, that you pull language out of its internal structural system and locate it within what we call, broadly speaking, the everyday messiness of life. Because it is in the everyday messiness of life that you have overlapping conditions that impact lives of people. It is in the everyday messiness of life that you actually can see and understand, and locate, different forms of inequalities within which language is also embedded, right? So that's, broadly speaking, is when you talk about criticality in the field, is what social linguistics or linguistics is all about. But my point here, I think, to me, and this is, I think, my main message today, is that I still find this kind of critical work problematic, in the sense that the kind of critical work that we generally engage in, it remains deeply decontextualized and dehistoricized. And I think that has got something to do, perhaps, to me, because there is so much dependence on the so-called critical lenses that we are using. That the Filipino scholar, that the Filipino critic or the Filipino language scholar depends on these, wide array of, critical lenses through which we see the Philippines, through which we view the Philippines, through which we see, language issues in the country. In a sense, I am sympathetic to these critical lenses, but I think, to me, what needs to be emphasized is the fact that the Filipino scholar is lost in the criticism. The Filipino scholar is lost, in the manner by which these lenses overwhelm the kinds of readings and the kinds of interpretations that we have. So for example, I just would like to give one example, the very recent, very personal example. I was recently invited to contribute a chapter to a volume. I guess based on Ruth's introduction, you would know by now that I work within the field of language and education. So I will be working within this framework. So I was asked to talk about English language teaching, but a chapter on decolonizing English language teaching. I will not talk specifically about the topic because that is a giveaway, and for ethical reasons, I don't want to do that. So I did say yes. I said, yes, okay, I will talk about decolonizing English language teaching. A few weeks after, the reviews came back, and there are quite a number, but the very crucial review that was problematic, according to them, to my paper, is that it was too political. All right, it was too political, and to cut the story short, I backed out. I said I'm pulling my paper away because it's fundamentally not what this chapter is about. Okay, because after all, when talking about decolonizing English language teaching or decolonizing any sort of practices for that matter, you have to engage in the messages of the political for that matter. So I guess I'm sharing this because this is decolonization, decoloniality, and its related terms. Of course, these are just simply a few of the many other terms that are available in the field. But this is, I think, to me, an example of how critical lenses remain very much decontextualized in the field, remain depoliticized in the field, that somehow along the way, the historical foundations of these lenses have somehow been cut off from the criticism, have been cut off from the way language is interpreted or evaluated, for example. And so what we have are fashionable terms, and which sound and look really very critical, but what you actually have are basically ways of engaging language in a different way, and yet basically remain the same in terms of the focus, all right, which is focus on the language itself, focus on basically language in isolation from the rest of society. I think, but the point here, therefore, is that while we are in a sense overwhelmed by these critical lenses, and that the critic or the linguist or the critical language scholar loses his or her historicity, I think the way forward, I think, to me, is to bring the scholar back into the analysis. I think what we have missed out along the way is to examine, or in a sense self-examine, if you call it that, ourselves as scholars, right? And move away from depending on all of these critical lenses that we have supposedly, and examine our own positionalities as scholars in the first place. And in here, I'm talking, for example, again, in very practical terms, how we, let's say, as teachers, as language educators, as policy makers, as social linguists, as language policy and so on, makers, to think of ourselves not in these ways, in these manners, but primarily as members of certain communities, as part of certain communities, engaged again, in the everyday struggles and messiness of life. And it is here, therefore, that we can make connections between what we do as scholars and what we do as critics, and what we do beyond the confines of the academe, and so on and so forth. I will end, therefore, hopefully we have more time, therefore, by saying that I think the way forward to me, and I've been saying this in my own research again and again, that critical engagement through the lens of linguistics has to be about decentering language. In other words, we need to decenter language in language studies. It sounds a bit like a contradiction, but I think, to me, to be able to illuminate on the complexity and dynamics of language use, we need to move away from a focus on language and move that lens towards a focus on the speakers of the language. Because by looking at the speakers of the language, by viewing the speakers of the language, then we understand the everyday conditions of the speakers, within which their use of language, within which the power dynamics in the use of language is embedded. And that is where I think the strength and the power of language can emerge, because then it's a language that emerges from kung sa atin pa battle-scarred kind of language use, instead of looking at language from afar, dissecting it and opening it up decontextualized and ahistorical. I think to me, we need to decenter, we need to move away from a focus on language to be able to do language studies. I think that's about it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tops. Really interesting, no? Couple of points. So, I could just like sum up some of your important points. I love the term everyday messiness of life and how you tied this to problematizing the subject position of critics and scholars, no? Masyadong malayo, no? We're so enamored with all of this like fashion, as what you say, mga fashionable terms. Although they still look at the same object of study, it's still language. And what you suggest is to move away from the contextualizing language and look at the language speakers. Right? And I'm pretty sure this is also based on your experience as a multilingual speaker, no?
Speaker,
Akyano, Tagalog, Filipino, and Bisaya, Hiligay nun. You speak Hiligay nun also.
Hiligay nun, definitely, fluent
Hiligay
as well.
nun, right? And yung questions and of course, a very important term you raised is decolonizing itself, no? Not just the decolonizing the study of language. Look at it from particular subject position and for us to be all self-aware, to be aware, no? To be aware of and to examine our positions as scholars and critics.
That's right.
I also remember that line when you say the Filipino critic is lost in critical lenses.
Because it's a deeply personal experience as well. I think it's when we move the lens towards ourselves, I think, and the speakers of the languages that we study, that important matters leak out, I think, away from the lenses.
And everything becomes more concrete, no?
Exactly.
It becomes more concrete. You don't look at language as an abstract concept or a phenomenon. Okay. Thank you very much. I'm sure a lot of our scholars, our participants will have questions for you later on. Sige. Let's now all listen to Ma'am Lily Rose, no? Taking off naman from her Southeast Asian subject position, Pinoy subject position. Thank you very much, Tops.
Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. First of all, thank you to the department for inviting me back. I miss you all. What I'm going to do is basically describe as first of all, the critical practice in the Philippines. This is mostly literature, so I'm not going to touch language here. And then I'm going to basically follow the questions that was given to us. So where are we coming from? So I would like to begin with the highlights of Philippine literary criticism in English. I will not touch literary criticism in Filipino or Spanish and limit myself to those written in English. So one of the first highlight of critical practice in the Philippines is the great debate between Jose Garcia Villa, Art for Art's Sake, and Salvador Lopez for Literature and Society in the 1930s. Interestingly, this debate has not ended, and even today, we still find our writers or even our critics debating which is more important, form and craft or social engagement. But this period already shows to us the great influence of American criticism in our critical practice. The second highlight would be the new criticism wave in the 1950s. The new criticism further strengthened the concern for craft and form, and it sealed American influence through the Iowa Writers Program. So writers' workshops like the Diliman Writers' Workshop became the gate of acceptance. So they became the gatekeepers of acceptance to many writers, thereby establishing the paradigm with which literature will be read for many years. And then in the 1960s, there was the resurgence of nationalism and the influence of Marxist and Maoist thought in Philippine writing. This is where the language debate became very strong. writers and critics had to decide whether to use English or not, English being the colonial language and being nationalistic, therefore, means shifting over to Filipino. And we have a lot of writers who have done that, and the same way with critics. Now, this is also the period that saw the spread of social realism, the paksa guidelines being the commandments to writing. What is important about this period is that it made Filipino critics examine their culture historically, veering away from American or Western readings of our own literature and culture. So this was the beginning. The 80s and 90s saw the establishment and strengthening of Philippine studies. So I will not make any analysis of Philippine studies here yet as a program or as a system of scholarship. I will just simply describe the why of Philippine studies, which is to make Filipino scholars dig deep into cultural phenomena, discovering the wealth of unexplored materials and the dearth of studies from a Filipino perspective. I think it was a period, especially in the department, that nobody wanted to go abroad because they thought that everything they need to study can be found here in the Philippines. The 90s saw the influx of literary theory. So sorry for my dogs. Okay, the 90s saw the influx of literary theory, structuralism, post-structuralism, feminism, post-colonialism, which the Filipino critic readily embraced as new ways of reading our culture. And the last 2 decades have been highly eclectic and globalized. The smorgasbord of available literary theories is actually exciting and daunting at the same time. Where is Philippine criticism going? At present, cultural studies seem to be a favorite place. So memory studies, sensory studies, digital humanities, translation and transmedial studies are just some examples of the paths taken by our critics. Literary criticism has always been interdisciplinary, even a few decades ago, but it has become even more so at present. More critical theories in this age add to the list: affect theory, eco-criticism, the race theories, among others. What newer world should the Filipino critic seek? In all these critical activities, one good thing that has happened is our increased and continuing interest in things Philippine. So we have our great critics like Resil Mojares, Bienvenido Lombera, Gemino Abad, Neil Garcia, who actually is the Filipino vanguard in Philippine queer theory. These are just some names that come to mind. But the sad part, and I think I echo Tapsi's talk here, is that we are still bound to theories from the West. I would like to think that someday there will be a theory more Philippine in nature that would affirm or question readings of our literature, but informed enough of our cultural conditions. In international scholarship, in the review processes, for example, reviewers still look for Western theoreticians. So I would like to imagine an article with a bibliography full of Filipino theoreticians. Of course, the reviewers may not know them, so they should go research. Be approved on an equal basis as an article with only Western theoreticians. I had a little experience with this. I wrote an article on Malaysian literature, and the draft kept coming back to me saying that, you know, something is missing, something must be improved, and so on. And I tried very hard to improve it, but finally I found out that what they were looking for were Western theoreticians on Malaysian things. So I found it very odd, you know. So there you go. I would also like the Filipino scholar to explore Southeast Asian literature, which is an understudied area in Philippine literary criticism. So despite efforts of people like me and Carol, there's still a dearth of Filipino scholars writing on Southeast Asian literature. Not only because this is my area of interest, but it also saddens me that we as neighbors do not really read or write about each other. It would be good if a literary theory emerges from the region, a theory that would be reflective of the complexities of Southeast Asian cultures. We are in a way lucky in the Philippines because if we specialize on Philippine literature in whatever language, in our case, Philippine literature in English, we can get a tenure, we can get promoted, and so on. In some universities in Southeast Asia, that's not the case. So I know of a colleague in Singapore who wrote excellent articles on Singapore literature, but was not given tenure because his works were not on Victorian lit, and so on. Okay. I would also want to see the creative writing part of our department, for our program, as having its own field of study, a kind of creative writing studies, which is the study of creative practices, not the what, but the why or the how of the creative process. So I think we have already started that in a way, so it just needs to be pursued. The English language, regardless of its colonial affiliation, has given the Filipino critic in English actually an advantage. His or her proficiency in the language provides opportunities not given to, say, Filipino critics in Filipino in the international stage. We feel this thing, in fact, in our UP Awards. So writers in Filipino has to be given a special category, and inadvertently, it sets them apart, which is both good and bad, I think. Many in my generation still feel conflicted about the use of English as a medium of criticism. But for the younger generation, I think the colonial color has been elided. It doesn't matter anymore, or it seems like that. The fact that there are now Englishes, even unequal Englishes, thanks for that, Caps, set a new paradigm by which we can make English a language of nationalism. I want to end this short talk on a note of encouragement. Critical scholarship can be a product of studious reading. We are used to that, but it can also be a product of unexpected moments of propinquity. For example, one can be dragged into a new area of study one knows nothing about because of friendship. So Judy, our Shakespeare expert, has been dragged into Asian and Southeast Asian theater because of me. Initially, she didn't know anything about Asia. And of course, up to now, she still blames me for this segue in her scholarly life. Or it may be something as innocuous as a dinner in a Singapore hawker center where friends exchange department gossip. The conversation suddenly turns towards Filipino boy bands, SB19, with Emil Flores doing most of the talking. So though Ancheta and Amy Flores were there. And before you know it, Ruanni Tupas is churning out these wonderful articles about Alamat, another boy band, and P-pop in general, articulated in the concepts of language theories. How good is that? So to everyone who wants to go into a new area of study, don't be afraid, go ahead. So I would like to end my short talk here, and I look forward to questions later on. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ma'am Lily Rose. Ka-inspire naman yan, ano? Serendipitus, mga pag-uusap, no? Coming up with, as a way of coming up with new areas of study, no? Swerte-swerte lang yan, di ba? Sometimes. Okay, so thank you very much for your discussion. You more or less directed our attention to the major developments in Philippine criticism in English, no, its trajectory and its possible directions. You also brought up several suggestions what you want to see, no. We see our practice in the context of and in relation to Southeast Asian literature and theory. Also connecting your ideas with the idea of Topsy, of to come up with our own critical lens, or even or linking it or seeing connection between our critical practice and critical practices in Asia. No? Medyo kulang talaga, no? But we do have quite a number of, good news naman, no? We do have quite a number of MA students in Asian literature. Yeah, so there's, I think we have, medyo they're now interested, no, in our neighbors, about time, okay? And then we need more scholars in this area to produce theory. or ideas of aesthetics, no? And thank you very much for those examples you gave us, examples of the review process, examples of how, we see the importance or the advantage also of writing in English. And it's not necessarily a colonial tool, which, we can actually use to our advantage, the opportunities we get by using the English language. And lastly, I think what is very interesting also in what you raised is the creative writing studies,
Right.
which will look at into the how and the why of writing. In the writing. Okay. So thank you very much, Ma'am Lily Rose. And then there are a few questions now in the Q&A box, which we will direct to you later. Salamat, ma'am. Our third speaker is Carol Hau.
Thank you very much, Ruth.
Thank you, Carol.
And thank you everyone for giving me an opportunity to be part of the DECL conversation series. Ninenervyos ako, so magbabasa lang ako. Here goes. As an undergraduate student, an instructor, and a part-time graduate student at the DECL from 1986 to 1993, I was immersed in a learning ecosystem that was, methodologically speaking, pretty diverse. It's true that literary studies then was largely new critical, formalist in spirit, orientation, and method. English majors studied the classics and engaged in close reading of literary works. My area of concentration was imaginative writing, not creative writing. We read and tried to write stories, plays, and poems, not texts. We analyzed, we did not critique, let alone theorize. Few of the general education courses at UP were being taught in Filipino then, hardly any in other Philippine languages. Comparative literature was literature read almost exclusively in English translation, and there were no courses specifically devoted to Third World or emergent literature, nor to the literature of Southeast Asia and the Pacific, the Caribbean and Latin America, and Africa. I was fortunate, though, to have had excellent teachers, mentors, friends, and colleagues. The education I received within, and just as important, outside the classroom, was not entirely colonial or neo-colonial. Grounding in English and American literature was rounded out by language training, in my case, in Spanish, French, and Chinese, and by courses on Philippine, European, and Asian literature. I wish there had been a major in comparative Philippine literature in Filipino and other Philippine languages at the time, as there is now, I believe, even as I was well aware that several of my colleagues were working on Pangasinan, Bicol, Ilocano, and Cebuano literature, among others, and on Southeast Asian literatures and languages, and also on Western literature, which is a kind of area studies. I was learning more about post-structuralist, feminist, post-colonial, ethnic and race and critical theories, again, mainly in English or in English translation, but I was simultaneously becoming deeply interested in Filipino nationalism and the radical tradition in Philippine literature, culture, politics, and political thought. The methodological eclecticism of this critical ecosystem is part and parcel of the general intellectual trend towards pluralism and convergence, to borrow from Virginia Miralao and Cynthia Bautista's characterization of Philippine studies in the post-EDSA years. Ours is an epoch distinct from, though I would argue not entirely unindebted nor unresponsive to, what Vince Raphael calls the long 1970s, which had been a time of intense political, intellectual, and creative ferment, a time when Filipino critical engagement with Marxism, Leninism, Maoism, and the indigenization movement, particularly in psychology and history, constituted two of the most notable and influential attempts at intellectual decolonization. Certainly, the most notable development of the past 30 years has been the fact that, as Resil Mojares points out, the center of gravity of Philippine studies has shifted from the US to the Philippines, at least in the social sciences, if not always in the humanities. The sea change owes as much to the retreat of area studies in the US as to the Philippines' newly minted status as an emergent economy and the economic importance more generally of the Asian region, and to the shifting geopolitical strategic interests and coalitions in the name of the ASEAN, Asia-Pacific, East Asia, Trans-Pacific, and now Indo-Pacific region. but it is also the product of the expansion of university and graduate educational opportunities for Filipinos in as well as beyond the Philippines. More Filipino students and scholars are being trained and are active at home and abroad, and not necessarily in Manila or the US either. In the humanities especially, there is increased scholarly participation from diasporic scholars, as well as Filipino foreigners and their descendants, particularly in American academia and mainstream publishing. The multi-sidedness and global expanse of intellectual production, which Lily Rose already talks about, are balanced out by a growing attentiveness to the question of audience, as more Filipinists respond to the imperative to make their research results available in the Philippines to Filipino readers by publishing or at least arranging for co-publication and participating in academic activities in the Philippines. While publishing with academic presses is still required to launch and secure academic careers, researchers also use independent publishing, the internet and social media, and other networking venues and platforms to share and debate ideas. And while location in America, as well as Manila and other regional urban centers, comes with their own hierarchies and inequalities and asymmetrical access, their epistemic and institutional privilege and authority are no longer unquestionable. The shift in the center of gravity of Philippine studies is not just a product of geopolitical and economic imperatives and demographic and institutional change. It owes something as well to the intellectual repositioning of the Philippines away from the margins, or more accurately, the reclaiming of the margins as a site of intellectual exploration and production. For years, Philippine studies conducted outside the Philippines, including and especially the US, had been viewed largely as a marginal field or area. Not only was the Philippines accorded tangential, if not peripheral status in American, Spanish, Latin American, and even Asian American studies, it was considered an outlier as well in Southeast Asian, and Malay studies. In recent decades, however, historians have begun paying closer attention to what Sanjay Subramaniam calls the, quote, global and connected character of the early modern period, unquote. One where the so-called Manila system, far from being peripheral, played a strategic role as a diplomatic, commercial, and cultural exchange hub of the long-distance trade linking the Atlantic and Pacific worlds. Other historians date the birth of world trade, the reorganization of the East Asian tribute and trade system, and China's silver century to the establishment of the entrepot city of Manila in 1571. In other words, scholars have begun offering fine-grained accounts, theoretical, comparative, and historical, of the Philippine experience of and contribution to a world wrought out of long-distance trade and contact, colonialism and imperialism, neocolonialism and neoliberalism, and the translocal, transregional, and global flows and movements of people, goods, ideas, technology, statecraft, material cultures, and lifeways, not only between so-called metropoles and peripheries, but within and among metropoles and peripheries. Moreover, the truly global scope of Filipino migration forces Philippine specialists to reckon with life worlds that are connected yet are not necessarily reducible to the framework, whether territorial, existential, political, intellectual, cultural, social, and otherwise, of the Philippine nation state. This has important and lasting implications for research and study in the humanities, which had hitherto been conducted mainly in English and oriented toward the scholarly and intellectual trends of a mainly Anglophone West that is heavily mediated by what I would call the Manila-America dyad. While national and bilateral, especially US-Philippines frameworks, may be analytically useful for some studies, neither methodological nationalism nor US-centered bilateralism is adequate for comprehending the history, cultural logic, politics, economics, and quotidian practices of place and community making in the name of, or even above and against and away from, the Philippines and Filipinos. We now know that the concept of the Filipino diaspora can no longer take the category of the Filipino-American for granted as empirical typecase, theoretical mediator, or cultural broker. We also know the challenges faced by literary studies in the Philippines, where writing in Filipino and other Philippine languages, or even in English, offers no guarantee of membership in the World Republic of Letters, and where a certain colonial mentality still obtains among some practitioners who view publishing in the US and crafting one's work to appeal to Anglophone, meaning overwhelmingly stateside, tastes, fashions, sensibilities, and ideologies as a status marker signifying that the Filipino writer has made it big or knows what he or she or they are talking about. Literary and more generally critical studies of the past 3 decades are more cognizant of, though much more research remains to be done, on issues concerning the marginal and the popular, the national and its exclusions and inclusions, and the regional, understood in both senses of below and above the nation as units of analysis. This may be largely a legacy of the 1960s and 70s, but it has had the salutary effect of encouraging and promoting more critical work by new generations of Filipino scholars and cultural workers who are proficient not only in English and Filipino, but also in various Philippine as well as non-Philippine languages. Critical studies have also perforce become much more interdisciplinary, as Lily Rose has talked about, if not transdisciplinary, as students and scholars range across the disciplines, not only of politics, history, anthropology, sociology, and cultural studies, but also economics and the natural sciences, though much more also remains to be done to promote sustained dialogue, collaboration, and critical engagement across networks, disciplines, and institutions on local, national, regional, and global scales. Much more remains to be done as far as intellectual decolonization is concerned, as Topsy has mentioned. Training in both Philippine and non-Philippine languages other than English is also a must if we are to lessen our reliance on English as the principal cultural and intellectual mediator of the outside world. The work of translation and the work of learning multiple languages remain crucial to this critical endeavor. This also means creating safe havens for open debate and critically engaged research, activism, living, and world-making that can resist the depredations of state and market and create alternatives to what Jerry Muller calls the tyranny of metrics that has made inroads into academia in the Philippines and elsewhere. The popularity of populism, including the murderous strongman Duterte variety, and the harassment, jailing, and killing of journalists and activists, including writers, are sober reminders that we still need to critically engage with the concepts of nation, class, state, religion, family, gender and sexuality, race or ethnicity, and community, as well as power and privilege, justice, equality, liberty, institution, capital, life and non-life forms, nature and environment, climate, cosmos, science and technology. To the laudable effort to study the localities and regions, the popular and the marginal and the indigenous, I add Resil Mohares' rejoinder to deepen, quote, our appreciation for the world within the nation by investigating the linkages, connections, and correspondences that extend beyond the territorial borders of the nation and its localities, by undertaking more comparative and multi-sided studies, or by simply making greater use of world scholarship in better understanding the nation and its localities, unquote. This means being attentive to questions of context and constitutiveness, relationality if not entanglement, purpose and practice, potentiality but also constraint and limitation, similarity and difference, singularity and multiplicity, temporality and contingency. This means that while theorization is important, it cannot consist of the application of theory to Philippine realities, and it requires more than just a passing familiarity with other disciplines, other knowledges beyond one's own field of expertise. This also means that while English remains an important medium of communication, it should be counted as just one among many languages that we ought to learn and work in. Above all, this means affirming one's commitment to the fact that the Philippines and the different units that are subsumable and just as important, non-subsumable under its rubric, provide fertile ground for deepening the decolonization process while spurring intellectual inquiry and creative work that are capable of producing insights and knowledge that can be shared with the rest of the world. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Carol. Wonderful, no? Para it also her discussion also like is very much connected to the points raised by our two earlier speakers or discussants. So I just noted some very critical ideas. I mean, for me also, no, as a critic and as a teach or as a faculty of UP. No? First is that in sharing with us your experiences as an undergraduate student in UP, we see how our programs have developed from over the years and towards what other possible directions we can further push them. The context of the critical ecosystem during your time, parang tagal na, no? Yun naman, mga 10 years ago, is very important. No? It's crucial in understanding the different historical, socio-political, cultural forces that inform the changes and development in academe. I think this is very, very important also for our scholars, no? So they can see, from a distance, where all these courses that we've been offering or that we are offering, the roots of this or the rationale behind the courses that we are offering today in our different programs. You located the Filipino students, scholars, and intellectuals in multiple sites of what you call critical production. Yeah. And what is important to note in the discussion is how Philippine studies is part of a network of global flows, of movements of peoples, goods, ideas, technology, and material culture. Okay. Also related to the discussions of Ma'am Lily Rose and Topsy are your points on decolonization. I think that's a recurring idea in all three discussions. Many of our students we're happy actually that many of our students now are working on the literatures and cultural texts of their regions and localities. And we do encourage them, if we know they come from the regions, no, they speak a particular Philippine language, we do encourage them to work on the literatures of their localities because, of course, they know. I mean, they're very much grounded in the culture of their provinces or their regions. In echoing Resil Mojares' position to deepen our appreciation for the world within the nation, you end your discussion with the following suggestions. The need to explore connections and linkages that go beyond national borders, also reiterated or also expressed by Ma'am Lily Rose. The need to undertake more comparative and multi-sited studies, and to make use of world scholarship to further our understanding of the nation and its localities. And important in all of this is the realization that although English is a very important medium of communication, we do really have to learn and work in other languages as well. I guess as Filipinos, no, we're actually we have that advantage because we speak. Naku, Topsy, how many languages in the Philippines do we have? No, there's so much potential out there. No, I would like to connect all of what you've raised to the points raised also by Topsy and Ma'am Lily Rose, because all of your discussions in various iterations call for the need to continuously engage with the world from our particular subject position as Filipino scholars, who are at the same time, I think, trying to expand and deepen our understanding of who we are. And that's a short summary of all the three discussions. Now, I hope I've captured basically, more or less your ideas. We do have quite a number of questions lined up for all of you, no? So let me start with the first question. I think this is addressed to Tops. Should we focus on... No, wait. Here. Medyo reluctant yung nagtanong because he says, can we really move the lenses to the language users in critiquing the language itself? Tops, I think that's parang practical question. How do you do this? No? Is it even possible?
Yeah, I think it's because we can always start with research questions that have got something to do with, what, the speakers and the users themselves are actually engaged in. Because it is in the process of, again, investigating, these, messy and overlapping conditions of ways within which our lives are imbricated, that actually it is within this that language emerges. Kaya ang sabi ko kasi it actually strengthens the study of language rather than decenters, even if I initially say, we need to decenter language. right? I guess the point being that we need to bring language back to the speakers. We need to bring language back to the multilingual Filipino to start with, right? Because again, as what I said, I also, going back to the time that I was in the undergrad and also doing my own masters in the same department, there was so much soul searching going on, in among so many of us, because there was just it was just so difficult to capture who we are as multilingual speakers, as multilingual critics as well, precisely because the theories that we were engaged in were, in a sense, not, in a sense, there to help us basically enlighten us, or at least give us an understanding of who we are as speakers. And I think that's the reason why, is because those approaches themselves dissociated language from the speakers themselves. So my point basically is just bring them all back. But when you bring them all back to the speakers, mas complex siya. Kasi, we are all complex individuals. We operate in different platforms of conditions of inequality. And we need to disentangle that to be able to understand the critical role of language.
Okay, thank you very much. Another question on language. Here, for all the speakers, there seems to be, this is from Julian de la Serna, no? There seems to be a general celebratory tone with the concept of Philippine English. Do you think it still needs to be problematized in relation to the national and regional languages, especially their power relations? Also, what do you think of what do you think of standardizing Philippine English to set guidelines for Filipino copy editors? And then, again, very fascinating and magandang question to, no? Very practical, and we do encounter this issue, no? The current situation is that the Philippine publishing industry still heavily relies on standards set by American language authorities, such as the CMOS, Chicago Manual, no? And MLA. Interestingly, we follow and use the US variation as opposed to Malaysia and India, which follow the British. Okay, so, ma'am, anyone? This question is addressed to all of the panel members. Ma'am Lily Rose, Topsy.
Ako muna.
Sige.
Okay.
Ma'am Lily Rose, then si Carol, and then Topsy.
Okay. Of course, Philippine English still must be problematized. It has not really reached its maturity. It is, okay, this is not my territory, so I will just be descriptive here. Philippine English can be seen many ways. There are the purists who would probably say that no, we should stick to standard English, standard meaning American or British. But there are also some people, the sociolinguists, for example, who say that Philippine English is like what do you call that? A natural product of engagement, no, between speaker and the language. So there are two schools regarding this. Now, can we use this for publishing? This is the tricky part. Okay, if you are in the Philippines, then maybe, some publishers will allow it. But if you are publishing abroad, then, it may not be acceptable. I've experienced that because sometimes I do have my Philippinisms and it always gets edited out. Even if I think, that using the Philippinisms would probably express more accurately, more authentically what I'm trying to say. So that's my experience of it.
Thank you very much, Ma'am Lily Rose. Thank you, Carol.
Well, I think Lily Rose already mentioned this, that this is one of the legacy of the radical 60s and 70s was the fact that, language as Topsy says, continually gets to be problematized, and particularly English. So for a whole generation of scholars, the decision to continue writing in English or not to write in English, was pretty existential, no? It was really part of the kind of intellectual exploration of that era. And I don't think we ever, overcame that. And I think it's a good thing to always keep the language in mind. So what Topsy was saying and what Lily Rose was saying was very relevant, that, what language you choose to write in, who you want to write to and address. I think they continue to be sort of guideposts for Filipino intellectuals and scholars. So I think that is a good thing rather than a bad thing. Having said that, probably there's still more space for, I suppose, both Philippine publishing and world publishing to be more open to the kinds of Englishes and also kinds of Filipino, languages that could be productively used in creative work. So I have had experience working with presses, in publishing, for example, a novel and short stories, where pretty much if you work with UP Press and Ateneo Press, it's not really a problem. They don't insist that you should italicize, our native languages. They're okay with us using, sentences upon sentences. In the case of Daryl Delgado, an entire, sort of non-English transcript pa nga for her novel, So I maybe in the US it's a bit different, but we also see the works of Filipino Americans like Elaine Castillo, where they actually use quite a lot of, not really Philippine English, but they actually use quite a lot of Philippine languages. I remember Pangasinan being one of them, and Ilocano and Tagalog, and they're sort of, I think this post-colonial moment has had its impact on at least US publishing. So you could think of it that way. But having said that, there are still, sort of standards that people sometimes consciously or unconsciously enforce. And you can see this in, the way in which, for example, if you're publishing with a UK publisher, you have to Britishize all your, your formatting and stuff. There's also the question that when the editor sometimes actually edits your language, and then they kind of change it to Americanize it or to Anglicize it or something. But this is pretty much part of the sort of hazards of publishing abroad. So that's why I prefer to publish in the Philippines.
Thank you very much. Hazards, no? The hazards.
Yes.
No. Siyempre, hindi mo siya comfort zone, no? We're all coming from a certain Philippine English, right? They both insist on standards, really. And as Carol said, despite that celebratory tone, the concept of Philippine English, I guess most of us do problematize it all the time, or at the back of our minds. No? We do, So, okay, sige, Taps, your turn. Thank you, Carol.
Okay, so, one of the things, because I still work very closely with students and teachers, teacher educators in the Philippines, and when things like, issues like this really come up, I think one of the things that I usually, engage in conversations is to ask them, what if we think of, because, the common discourse in English is that it is an advantage, that the common discourse in using English, let's say in our writing, in our criticism, is that it is an advantage. So I basically throw it back to them. What if we frame English as a disadvantage? Our ability to write in English as a disadvantage, just a way to get us thinking about, a different way of looking at language. Not so much to get to the point that, hey, okay, let's trash English, but basically to ask questions about what does English do, and what does English prevent us from thinking and doing, if, we are proficient, for example, in the language, in our own academic writing. And the discussions then go further, and basically then we start talking about, reevaluating the Philippine languages, in criticism, in the writing. Because I think, to me, that's the very first thing that needs to be done, to reevaluating, at least in our field, in language education, for example, reevaluating the Philippine languages. Because even in the context, for example, of, mother tongue multilingual education, the Philippine languages, in terms of attitudes of teachers, remain very much devalued in comparison to English. So even if you have these policies in place, it still perpetuates the English only kinds of ideologies in the classroom and in Philippine society. So thinking or rethinking English, for example, as a disadvantage, not so much again in terms of doing away with it, but in terms of what can it do and what does it prevent us from thinking about ourselves and the Philippines. I think it helps surface different sets of issues that will raise perhaps the profile of these Philippine languages. In terms of Philippine English as well. I think Carol and Lil Rose already mentioned this, but perhaps what I would like to add basically is to think of Philippine English, because many of the things that people associate with Philippine English are very small phrases, iconic kinds of places. So these are Philippine English. But I think Philippine English is far more than that. I think these are, you also have rhetorical traditions that are associated with different Englishes in the world. You also have discourses, semantic fields, so to speak, meanings that are associated with certain Englishes in the world. I think to me, kung meron ako yung paglalaban sa mga editors, it is these. Not this little things about language, because I think to me it's important that it is this much more embedded kinds of rhetorical traditions and meanings that are associated with, let's say, Philippine English or Philippine Englishes for that matter, that I think I would go for in terms of fight your own battles, and this is one of the things that I would like to fight for, not cope or cope with, for example.
Yeah. I remember as young faculty members, di ba? Cope up, cope with, just kailangan feeling.
Yeah, and then I remember we got to the point of saying that's imperialist.
Oo, di ba? Yung sobrang pagpapawisan ka sa use of prepositions, di ba? Although you're very conscious also because we're already teachers, di ba? Parang you look at it from different perspectives, no? I guess it's really difficult not to get out of that, kasi yung grid of intelligibility has always been the West, no? So it takes so much effort also on the part of scholars to think, to move away from what we've always been using as critical lens, no? Okay, thank you. Thank you, Topsin. Cope up, cope with. Okay. Next question has something to do with Ma'am Lily Rose. Sorry, your area.
Okay.
The Philippines has a history that makes it arguably more Western than Southeast Asian. Is it possible that this creates a hindrance to Filipino scholars coming up with theoretical writing that is Southeast Asia in nature? And this is, we can probably relate this to the other question, no? Which is, why do our neighbors or why do countries in Southeast Asia don't write about each other? why are we not conversing? No?
Okay.
Yeah. Okay.
Sige, mahabang storya yan, no? But to put it very simply, okay, let me begin with the first. The Philippines is not the most westernized country in Southeast Asia. At present, I would think that Singapore is just as westernized. They speak more English than we do. Their literacy rate is higher than ours. So I don't know if that counts as being westernized. Of course, they're richer, right? And their English is very British. Ours is American. So for European publishers, their English is preferable. Of course, for American publishers, our English is more preferable. But again, for the second part of the question, why are we not reading and writing each other? Because we have different colonizers. Before the period, before we were colonized, there was a good traffic among Southeast Asian countries. So we have, for example, Malaccan traders coming to the Philippines, to Indonesia. So there was a good commercial and cultural exchange, no, among the countries in Southeast Asia. That is how Buddhism, Hinduism, and Islam came to Southeast Asia. But we had different colonizers. So Malaysia and Singapore were colonized by the British, Indonesia by the Dutch, what do you call this? Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia were by the French, and of course the Philippines by Spain and America. So in other words, we had different cultural. What's the plural for nexus? Nexi. We had different cultural centers. So when Filipinos want to, for example, pursue higher studies, it's always America, it's always the US, Malaysia, and Singapore. It's always UK, and so on. So our cultural, centers, became different, and we lost that bond that we had previously. And Filipino children, school children, would read American literature. In Malaysia and Singapore, they would read British literature and so on. And see, this is one of my most unanswered question. No? We all spoke English, but we never read each other. We never read each other. No? So English was our common language. I'm speaking of Anglophone Southeast Asia. English was our common language, but the Philippines hardly know Singapore or Malaysia and vice versa. So our students only learn of these countries in a classroom, in UP probably. But in Malaysia and Singapore, Philippine literature is not taught. Whereas we do teach Malaysian Singapore literature in English. So I think the guilty party is colonialism. So it kind of divided us, created boundaries that are hard to cross. But things, I think, are looking better now because of globalization, because of trade, commerce, etc. And I guess we can also say, because of our overseas Filipino workers, we are now looking at each other from different eyes, and the Singaporeans are starting to write about Filipino maids, and so on. So things are beginning to look better, and I hope this will continue. But still a lot have to be done. I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, thank you, Ma'am Lily Rose. Siguro that's also connected to what Carol mentioned earlier. Ano ba yung Manila America Dyad?
Yeah.
Manila America Dyad. Yeah, Carol mentioned also all the networks, the connections we had with other Asian countries before. We've been heavily influenced by American colonialism and that sort. Carol might have additional points on this.
I just wanted to add a little bit to what Lily Rose already talked about. I mean, in a sense, one of the sort of good effects of the Filipino-Lohia Pantayong Pananaw movement has been the fact that part of their intellectual decolonization entails also raising our awareness that there was this kind of cultural matrix that Lily Rose talks about, the kind of contacts and connections we had, to our Southeast Asian neighbors, which had been sort of papered over in the course of, the successive colonialisms, but also the fact that, in a sense, Southeast Asian studies, when it was constructed as a kind of, area of study, also tried to marginalize the Philippines by saying that, because you were colonized by, Spain,
America,
therefore you were cut off from, but that actually to some extent is correct, but to other extent is wrong. So it depends on what area you're looking at. If you're looking at what Topsy is looking at in the area of language, it's very clear that we kept our languages,
Right.
and our languages connect us to this, cultural matrix of, that we know as Southeast Asia. The other thing is that, in a sense, the kind of networks of distribution and circulation and validation of literary works and scholarship also seem to ensure that we get to know very little about what our neighbors are doing. Simply because, for example, if I want to read Dewi Lestari, I have to go to Indonesia to get her novel, and I have to learn Indonesian to read her. right? So we're hoping that, I know that there is a generation of young Filipino activists, some of whom are with this department, who are actually learning Bahasa Indonesia, and these people are actually reading, Indonesian literature in Bahasa, and they're forming networks with their fellow activists there. So I have every hope, that our students and scholars will find each other, and because I know there is strong solidarity among ASEAN members. I mean, these days we tend to talk to, oh, you're from Southeast Asia already, we form a little circle of our own. So I think maybe 6 decades of this kind of ASEAN thing may, all the sports we have watched and, whatever, so all the banal nationalist practices we have engaged in might have built already a little bit of, self-awareness of each other. And hopefully that would, encourage some of the students to actually specialize in Southeast Asia. So Lily Rose and Luisa Malyari were really and Telma Quintanar, who was my teacher. These were really the pioneers. So we're very lucky that DECL, in fact, as an early pioneer in promoting Southeast Asian literature and language studies.
Thank you.
Yeah, shout out to Domsi.
Oo nga eh.
Nandyan ba siya?
I'm sure he's there. And to Ina Borlasa, who wants to pursue also her research in Asia. I'm not sure kung what country. Baka Japan din also pala, Carol. No? So meron kaming dalawa. Kasi Ma'am Rose tatlo. Okay, so I'll just since we are in this topic, let me read some related questions. Related in the sense that they refer to the prospects of cultural studies in the Philippines or Philippine studies. No? Let's see. Here is considering the critical. This is addressed to all of the speakers. Considering the critical importance of decolonization, can Philippine critics learn from the efforts of Latin American scholars at decoloniality, or is our context too different, necessitating an entirely different approach? And may I tie that question to another question? Thank you for all your short talks. Sabi nung nagtatanong, all three of you talked about the need for critical theorizing from a Philippine rather than a Western orientation. Has there been significant movements in this area? Si Carol mentioned yung mga, mga pantayong pananaw, no? Pero 1980s ba yun? 80s, no? Filipinohiya. The second question, I think, refers to the more contemporary times, no? Has there been significant movement towards coming up with our own critical approaches? So, siguro we'll start with Topsy, tapos pag gano'n naman, Topsy, and then, so, yeah.
You're mute.
I'm mute.
Yeah, so I think even in the context of Latin American scholarship on decolonization, at least the stuff that I'm familiar with in the context of language studies and the framing that we use, there's also contestation over who gets to talk about decolonization, because many of these are centered in the US, right? And those centered in Latin American countries themselves basically say, the kinds of questions that are being asked are also different, and the kinds of solutions, so to speak, that being asked are also kind of different. So perhaps what I can say about that is, in terms of the logics of coloniality, I think that's something that we can learn from each other. But in terms of the historicities of colonialism, I think that's something that we need to be very specific to in that context. Maraming questions so I can probably just pick up one that I probably remember. We have been engaged. I mean, I have been engaged with also language scholars, from different parts of the world. Mga Pinoys din. Actually, Eileen is one of them. I think Eileen is there now, right? And there's Jean Segura Navera in Singapore and Beatrice Lorenta from Switzerland. And we have been for more than a year already, been engaged in reading, reading about Philippine basically reading about Philippine studies as well, because what we have realized, of course, is language scholars English language scholars, to a large extent have been framed, of course, by Western scholarship, and so even if going back, for example, to historical experiences of Filipinos and language scholars and so on and so forth, is in a sense we realize also a process of identity remaking for us as language scholars as well, precisely because even your citation lines, it's easy to say I need to change my citation line, but what is the alternative citation line that will surface your own Filipino-ness, in your scholarship? And that requires a lot of going back to the literature on Philippines, something that somehow we have missed out because the framing in our studies has somehow, excluded these, massive work on the Philippines that has been there for quite, not just actually a few decades, but for centuries as well. So that is what Filipino, at least for us, social linguists that are engaged in this kinds of work are doing at this point, trying to retrace, ideas about language that are not associated or that have a much longer historical trajectory than the kinds of ideas about language that we are engaged in or engaged with in sociolinguistics. To put it in a different perspective, for example, to concretize it, just for 30 seconds, yung mga ideas na we go back to in the 1960s in our field, nababasa na yun at sinasabi na yun, like in Jose Rizal, the intellectuals, the Ilustrado scholars in the 1900s, diba? And yet we credit these kinds of like enlightened ideas about language, and then we start from these in our citation lines. So I guess my point here is reimagining ourselves, our scholarship is also partly also or hugely about reimagining ourselves as language scholars.
Mm-hmm. Like that word, to reimagine ourselves. Okay, thank you, Ma'am Lily Rose.
Ako naman, as far as literary criticism is concerned, literary criticism in the Philippines in English is still very much Western bound, still very much affiliated to the West. And I must say that it is young because it was only 20th century, literary criticism in English. So we probably had criticism in Filipino or in Spanish before, but as far as the English section is concerned, it's just over 100 years. So I'm thinking that a future scholar of Filipino literary theory would put all these, writings together and come up with a distinctively Filipino perspective, as far as criticism is concerned. I also think that if there is a good source of criticism that is Philippine, it will be from the Filipino department, because they are the one actually immersed in the culture, the language, etc. So that's a good place to begin, if I may say so. So as far as criticism in English is concerned, we're still very far from coming up with something that is our own. The social sciences have already begun this, as Carol has said, but I don't know how if it has ever filtered into the humanities. Parang hindi ko siya naramdaman, so that's a big question also. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Well, I can think of two words that the Philippines has contributed to the global political theory and discourse. And one is crony capitalism and the other is people power. So we can begin with things like that,
Yeah.
and then I'm thinking about, for example, Bomen Guillermo's notion of pook, So how do you think about place as a kind of critical site for exploration, or Nefertiti Diar's, disposable lives or remaindered lives? I mean, so I think, Filipino scholars in their own ways have been coming up with, ways to understand the Philippines, and the way in which things happen here actually provide us with important vantage points, perspectives, and insights that in fact have a great deal of relevance. So just think about, for example, the people power revolution. I mean, that term, and as well as yellow revolution. And now think about all these, the Arab Spring and all the color revolutions. I mean, where did that come from? It actually, so we, in fact, there have been many ways in which Filipino experiences, for example, of migration have led to the kind of cutting edge research, for example, of Racel Pareñas, who is one of the most cited researchers, or Vince Rafael on translation. The point is that, the kind of insights generated out of our own, experiences as Filipinos have provided fertile ground for scholars to work on. And these insights, in fact, have been filtering everywhere. So if I want to be more cynical about it, I would say that, we need to have much more economic growth in the coming 10 years and to vote into the, NIEs, and then we will be taken seriously. So the intellectual fashion tends to follow geopolitical and geoeconomic, pathways. And the fact that, the Philippines is now one of these hot countries that actually has good economic growth makes people think twice about comparing it to Latin America, because when Southeast Asian studies was kind of, being constructed as a kind of area studies, they always theorize that the Philippines has more in common with Latin America than with Asia. And there's something to be said about that, because we have certain common experiences with Latin America that make it actually very fruitful to compare the Philippines with Latin America. At the same time, we are located in Asia, and the Asian region has its own history and networks and stuff, which actually cannot be theorized by Latin Americans. So, for example, Immanuel Wallerstein's world system theory definitely doesn't apply to Asia. So Asia was one of the only regions that, defied the kind of, sort of metropole periphery relation. So Wallerstein said then it's semi-periphery, but that actually doesn't explain much. So I always think that when you put the word semi, patay na, kasi that means, you started qualifying whatever concept you have, right? So the point is that, we have things in common with Latin America. We have things in common with Asia. We have things in common with even with North America, because that is where a lot of our so-called democratic institutions come from. And scholars who want to understand the Philippines, I mean, during the colonial period, need to study the American, courthouse cliques and, sort of democratic institutions during the progressive era or even before that. So the point here is that I think critical approaches always work better when they are grounded in some kind of place, and this place is a kind of productive site for intellectual exploration, and this is in fact what yields the kind of insights that can be shared with the rest of the world. So if you want to think about crony capitalism, which has now been applied to China, then you start, and actually to America. So that term was coined in America to talk about the pathology of economic development in the Philippines, but now it has remigrated back and now been applied to them. Those who defined us as other. So talk about revenge.
Revenge, revenge, and that's also how language works, no? Talagang full circle siya, no? A lot of this is something, the issues that you've raised, ay talagang based on language, no? And I noticed this in most of the questions raised. I just group the questions that are related to each other. Tapos ibabalik na naman kami sa'yo. Kasi parang language talagang pinupuntriya. Specifically, I think because we're talking about the English language. And how, of course, we can be both celebratory and cynical about it, right? So the next three questions are all related, again related to the past, but now in relation rather to other Philippine languages. here comes naman a different angle, no? And I think like Topsy will be able to relate to this because of our multilingual, our Bisaya roots, no? Pag ganon, kasi may mga questions dito about that. Let's see. There is a conscious effort among writers and critics to explore. This is from Ray Hontenar from UP Visayas. To explore regional literature and indigenous knowledges, to theorize on the peculiarities and specialities of Philippine literature. Personally, how do you imagine the future of literary and cultural studies in the Philippines? Ma'am Lily Rose, this is from Ray. He's advising, he's from UPV. So
Hello, Ray.
so he's problematizing, the peculiarities and specialities of Philippine lit in relation, of course, to Philippine regional languages. Okay, so that's one that's one question. Hang on. Another one related, no? If Filipino writers in English have an advantage in the international scale, how can we turn writing in English as an advantage in the local scale without impeding or shadowing other Filipino languages? So now you see the dynamics, no? Parang within the Philippines and our Philippine English in relation to other Philippine languages. No? So who would want to say Topsy?
Yung first question kina Ma'am Lily Rose kay Carol yan eh.
Are you passing it on to Carol?
I mean that's something on the literature, studies.
You want me to repeat the question? There is a conscious effort among writers and critics to explore regional literature and indigenous knowledges, to theorize on the peculiarities and specialities of Philippine lit. It's more of this is language in relation to critical practice, no? How do you imagine the future of literary and cultural studies in the Philippines? Si Carol, pasa natin kay Carol.
Well, it's actually a good thing that people are writing more in the regional Philippine languages. But I have to say that, for example, Filipino novels in English do not get the kind of recognition they deserve in outside the Philippines, even though it is in English. So the writing in English doesn't guarantee visibility, let alone sort of recognition outside. And second, you see a phenomenon in which things Filipino, at least in America, are going to be mediated more by Filipino-American writers. I mean, for obvious reasons, because they are writing about, their ancestors' country, their experiences, and a lot of it is also part of their own identity and, ethnic relations in the US. But you will see that some of the more important works produced about the Philippines are actually written by Filipino-Americans, published in the US. So the point is that there's a kind of relationship in which Filipino Americans get to have more chances to mediate the relationship between the Philippines and the US, and Filipinos don't normally would get any chance to be published there. So advantage or disadvantage, I mean, this is exactly hewing close to what Topsy is talking about. Is English actually an advantage, or is it rather in fact a disadvantage? The second one is that we do want to have more translations going on, mainly because not all of us are fortunate enough to know more than one or two or at most three Philippine languages. It's a very rare talent to have someone who like Topsy who is fluent in several of them. So what I would hope to see is that we could have chance to read our fellow Filipinos in the different languages, but if possible to also embark on the work of translation among our own Philippine languages. And I think that is happening now too, but probably just need to encourage more of it.
Ma'am Lily Rose, I think during Ma'am Lily Rose's time, na translation track pa tayo in comparative literature, no?
Yeah.
Something that we should really like strengthen, no?
Do I answer?
Yes. Yeah, please.
Okay, so I will just zero in on the last question. The fact that many of our scholars are actually going back to their communities and studying their communities from that community's perspective, I think is a big leap in our scholarship. Ray, for example, studied queer, he used queer theory looking for a kind of Visayan definition of queer, which is not the same, no, as the Western definition of queer. So I thought that is a very interesting study, which allows us to know ourselves as Filipinos and as Visayans more deeply, that it actually proves that we have a culture that has existed even with before colonization, and that this culture has continued to live on. It may have a different iteration, but the elements of those cultures are still there. They have remained intact. And I think if we ferret out the elements of those cultures, then I think we have a good chance of theorizing it, not in the Western sense, but culturally informed by a Filipino culture.
Thank
That's all.
you. Right. No, Yes, Tapsi.
Yeah, sorry. So if you have something to say pa muna, because I'll go to number 2 question of yours.
Number 2 question. And then I also remember si Ray Hontanar wrote about the agi, no? In Iligay nun. And another scholar naman, si Francis Torres, wrote about the Cebuano Bayot. And ibang-iba din naman yung the idea of homosexuality, or of queer theory. Magkaibang, both naman halos Bisaya, di ba? Pero ibang-iba din yung approach nila. So it's very, the field is very rich, not necessarily with theoretical frameworks, but with concepts that we can call our own, no? And we analyze particular phenomenon from these angles or from these concepts. Sige, Taps. Thank you.
Okay, yeah. I think briefly, if I have to say about English and writing in English and celebrating it or not, for example, I think the greater question perhaps is whether we should actually, in fact, think of English as an advantage and celebrate that advantage, but at the same time, actually celebrate multilingualism instead, of which English is part. You see, so that's the thinking needs, the broad thinking about languages in the Philippines needs to change in the first place, instead of just simply looking at languages in English as an advantage, but celebrating multilingualism, and that somehow pushes certain practices forward. Now, I can talk a little bit about that in the context, for example, of language education research. One of the things that probably people don't really know about some of the effects of mother tongue-based multilingual education is that on the ground, teachers are actually asked to write their own stories. Teachers are asked to bring together or listen and ask and listen to stories in their communities, capture them, put and write them up in their own mother tongues as well. All right. So there are actually storybooks now, and we have social linguists, we have language education researchers who have actually been putting together these stories in the mother tongues, and these are the ones that are being used in the classrooms all over the Philippines. I think much of the talk about this kind of policy is about the medium of instruction, all right? But there's actually so much going on the ground, whereby teachers and parents actually come together, certain communities come together to put together their own stories in the mother tongues, in their own languages, write them up as picture books, in their own kinds of picture books. But of course, again, the material conditions come into the picture. Naghihingi ng mga walang pang Xerox, walang mga papel, mga ganong klaseng very basic in a sense, but very fundamental problems in these kinds of questions, right? In these kinds of issues. Another thing again is this is happening in the context again of this kind of thinking that English is superior to the mother tongues, all right? And that's why ako for the past year, I think because of the webinars, somehow one of these in a sense consequences of doing it online is I have been engaged much more radically. Siguro mga 100 webinars na ako with language educators, basically talking about the same thing, like this one, again and again and again and again and again and again. All right, because I think this has to be communicated across, on the ground as well among language teachers, because there's so much potential actually. All right. In these kinds of stories that are emerging from these communities, as captured by the educators themselves, and there's some work on that as well. So I think I can think of this as something like something to be optimistic about as far as opening up multilingualism to education and to society.
Thank you very much. And we have a couple of more questions, actually many more questions. Some of them are some of them related to language, but I think in all of your discussions, you've touched on the issues of English as an elitist language. It's association with elitism, the idea of a literary piece written in English, is it 100% Filipino? So medyo na-touch nyo naman tong mga ideas. And I mean, the ideas are really very complex, no? This entails a long discussion. But I'd like the speakers to address two questions first, which have something to do, I think this was raised by Ma'am Lily Rose. These questions are on creative writing, no? But nonetheless, related to the issues brought up by Carol and Topsy, no? Should we focus on the hows and whys of creative writing before emerging to create a more Philippine-based literary theory? Oh, this has something to do with priority ata, no? And then another question is from Marby, our faculty. I am interested in how, as scholars, we are able to challenge oppressive colonial systems, including the academe. For example, how do we decolonize our scholarship when part of being everybody, parang we can relate to this, no? When part of being promoted or tenured is based on being published and or cited in journals that can privilege colonial standards and ways of knowing. Very very a recurring question among faculty members, among scholars, no? In the promotion points kasi talagang you see asymmetrical, no? Asymmetrical. So two questions, one for Ma'am Lily Rose on what should we do first, no? Is it ways of creative writing before coming up with a Philippine-based literary theory? And the other one from Marby, I mean, addressed to all of you, how can we veer away from that kind of framework when our lives in UP, for example, are measured in terms of, colonial standards or based on colonial standards?
Okay. Me first, okay. So when I mentioned the creative writing studies, okay, so this is something we were mulling over before I retired from the department, which is to how do you put it? How to scholarize the creative practices, because we think of creative writing only as a creative activity, right? So you write, so on. But we wanted to create a field that will study why writers write or how writers write, not so much what they write, because that will be the purview of a literary analysis, for example, but the hows and whys of creative writing, that is something that has not really been explored, and we want to make that a scholarly field. So it's not a contest of literary theory, which comes first, no? But maybe a literary theory can come out of that, or a creative writing theory can come out of that. But we just wanted creative writing to be a scholarly field as well, not just a creative field. So that's the whole idea. So in other words, if you want to study about creative writing, and you're not a creative writer, you just want to study about it, study how writers write and why writers write what they write, So that can be a scholarly field. So that's the idea behind it.
And in a way that also generates theoretical understanding of the field. No?
Yeah, to theorize creative writing.
To theorize creative writing.
Yeah.
Thank you, Ma'am Lily Rose.
Artists.
Okay, Carol.
Well, I think it was Neil Garcia who once said or observed in one of his essays that, I mean, there's a kind of blurring of boundaries between creative writers and literary critics, at least for the DECL. And some of the people he named included, I think, Bliss Lim. I mean, Nefertiti Tadiar wrote poetry. Bliss wrote poetry. Bowman Guillermo wrote a novel. Edel Garceliano wrote, So I think we have a tradition. Joe Masison wrote poetry. Okay,
Caroline Hau.
Yes, Caroline Hau also.
The point is, quite a number of our, creative writers actually became critics, or there are critics who actually, or literary historians, who are creative writers. So that tends to be blurred. So there is, I think, a point to be made, as Lily Rose says, about you maybe taking creative writing more seriously as a kind of, mode of production, and a mode of both literary and critical production. Now, to the second question, I used to be very cynical, and I would tell, young researchers, get tenure and then you can do what the fuck you want, right? but I actually understand the kind of, travails and all the, shitty loopholes they have to, run through like bears in a circus before you get to tenure. And then by that time, you don't want to do anything anymore, right? So I think maybe one way of encouraging it is for, for example, the department as an institution to take a stand. One example I can cite is, the Kyoto University Center for Southeast Asian Studies. They could have followed the kind of Singapore model where, you publish in English, you go, publish in accredited, presses, or, maybe you don't even publish books anymore because only, journal articles matter these days. But I think, Kyoto University continually bucked the trend. And they basically said, we let you write in whatever language you want to write in. We know that you can write for many different audiences. We emphasize your connections to Southeast Asian, readers. So the point is, as an institution, the Center for Southeast Asian Studies took a stand and decided, for example, that they would never put their journal articles behind paywalls, because Southeast Asians, they wanted Southeast Asian readers to be able to download them for free. This actually cost. For example, when we were setting up a journal, somebody told us, if you don't put it behind the paywall, or if you don't go with Rutledge or Cambridge, you are going to be second rate. And I think to the credit of my Japanese colleagues, they said, well, first of all, we are using Japanese taxpayers' money. So we cannot be making profit from this. And second, fuck it, So, but I think it does have to do with the fact that, Japanese have their own, very big reading public. So these guys are more confident, and they don't think they need to play by the Anglo-Saxon rules to make it. But it is actually a conscious political decision they make. And it's a decision they make keeping their commitment to Southeast Asia in mind. So if an institution can collectively come together and make a decision that this is what we want to encourage, this is the kind of scholarship we want to do, then, you don't need to follow this, metrics trend, even if, the UP, up there tell you that, we need to do all these metrics. Fuck that, no good research has come out of this whole metric bullshit, and I can tell you that. So my own experience has been free range, curiosity-driven research is actually much more valuable, and we need to protect that, and we especially need to protect younger and more vulnerable scholars. So I would say those of us with tenure, you make sure you protect those who don't and encourage them. So that is a kind of more like a personal and institutional commitment that is necessary on our part.
We just have to make a stand, no?
You take a stand, and I think you buck the trend. You're not afraid if they say, oh, then you're second rate. We don't care about that. What's more important is, do you have a safe haven to encourage people to do good research?
True. And you get publication, you get knowledge, you produce knowledge, and reach the audience.
I think in fairness, UP has allowed tenure publications from our own journals, from UP-based journals, so long as they are peer-reviewed. So Humanities Diliman and the college-based journal, even Philippine Studies. So you can get tenure if you publish in these peer-reviewed journals. So in fairness to UP, so you don't have to publish internationally, right? For tenure.
Do they still pay people for publishing in international journals, like the 50,000 peso thing? Wala na?
Meron.
Meron pa rin.
Oo, IPA.
Why don't they pay us 50,000 pesos to get published in Humanities Diliman, right?
Carol, sana.
IPA, oo nga. Teka muna. Yung 50,000 sa IPA lang yan, pang international. Pero you can get 100,000 if you publish in Humanities Diliman, right?
Yeah.
Oh, there you go.
Yeah, right. What do you call that? Centennial
Professorial
Award.
So 100,000 yun, Humanities Diliman accepted doon.
Yes. Pero Carol, hindi si Carol faculty, so hindi siya makaka-apply. Yeah. So thank you very much for those insights. No. Babasahin ko lang si Nino De Vera, no, is also a faculty of UP Mindanao. I think he talked in relation to what Ma'am Lily Rose and what Carol said about yung creative writing studies, no. Parang he calls it a practice-led scholarship. He's a creative writer. He writes, but now he's taking his PhD with comparative literature naman. Parang binaliktad naman yan. Topsy, would you like to add to the points raised by Ma'am Lily Rose and Carol?
First of all, brown out kaya natural light.
Kaya nawala ka.
Kaya nawala ako.
May brown out dyan.
So sabihin ko, brown out sa London.
Yeah. No. I think only briefly, no, kasi nga that I think the reason why I need to go back to my earlier talk, sharing, that's why I think I need to this whole idea about decolonizing, the curriculum, that needs to be problematized, kasi in the end, there are institutions, there are conditions beyond, the teachers and beyond the scholars and ourselves, that impinge on our own practices as well. Kaya nga, I agree completely. There has to be some kind of a collective effort that has to be done to be able to move this particular these problems forward. Recently, in the field of linguistic ethnography, social linguistics, as well, the international journal editors came together, and they continue to band together to make a much more unified voice. Para ba kung sa atin pa to rally behind certain things that we want to happen in relation to publishers. Kasi what we all found out is that if journals work individually with publishers, parang hindi pinapakinggan. But if these are like a group of editors coming together, basically putting things forward. So I mean, these are in a sense baby steps, I think, but the possibility, for example, or the space given to languages other than English in the journals are now opening up to many of these journals in our fields, something that was unheard of like 10 or 20 years ago.
That's right.
Correct. So there's daming developments, like and I think people have started to converse to get their concerted efforts from practitioners to academic people to also to publishers, to journals who have, I think, also faculty members behind have faculty members behind these journals who are also very much aware of this asymmetrical relationship in terms of the use of language, standards, something, Well, it's magpa 5 o'clock now. We still have ang dami pang tanong. Everybody's so excited. But wait, I'm trying to figure out the last question. I think I will ask this question. It's from a faculty member, no. Very very practical. He's teaching CL 121, no, and this is practical in the sense that how to decolonize the classroom. So, tatanong siya mga, who are some important Philippine, of course, CL 121 in Diliman is classical, classical literary theories. But of course, you still do want to decolonize the classroom, even if you're teaching classical literary theories. No? The question is, who are some important Philippine and non-Western theories and critics before the, hirap naman ito, before the 20th century that I can read to help decolonize the literary criticism in the classroom? Parang nag-exam naman itong question na to, sorry. Just in case you have names in mind.
Okay.
Si Carol, meron nang nakalista.
Marami.
Okay.
Maybe for China, you might want to try Cao Ping's Compendium of Tang Poetry. So this is a kind of collection of Tang poetry, but there are, if you look at it, it actually gives you an idea of how, lyric poetry was conceived in China. And then for Japan, what is his name? Yoshida Kenko's Essays in Idleness, which has a lot of aesthetic insights about, stuff like yugen or, wabi-sabi. So some of these key Japanese aesthetics terms.
Right.
And then for Malay literature, maybe Hikayat Abdullah, which is a kind of, one of the earliest Malay, language memoirs to explore the concept of subjectivity. So Hikayat Abdullah, Cao Ming's compendium of Tang poetry, and Yoshida's Essays in Idleness. Just
thank you very much. May tuturo na siya, no? Mayroon na siyang reading list. Thank you, Carol. Ma'am Lily Rose.
May I add also the scholars on, this is the Indian scholars on rasa. Diba? It's a concept, a literary concept in India. I cannot name one because there's so many, so pili na lang siya. There are also literary concepts, even in the epics, like Mahabharata and Ramayana, nakapasok sa loob. Like the Bhagavad Gita, for example, meron siya dong literary theory. Of course, expressed in religious terms, so meron doon. Meron doon. So ano pa ba? I think sa Thailand meron din sila, kaya lang Buddhist. Buddhist ang context, but it also talks about what kind of good writing is, So sa kanila it has to be spiritually enlightening, and yung pinaka sa akin pinaka exciting, kasi usually Western theories or Western readings of literature tell us that if one is moralistic, ganyan, pangit yung literature. In Asia, it's the reverse, especially in classical literature. Pag may moral lesson, pag didactic yung piece, it is actually a superior text. And so this is why Western critics tend to look at Asian texts as inferior kasi hindi man nila naintindihan, So sabi nila, very preachy, very parang 10 Commandments naman ito, ganyan. Pero actually, it's part of the conventions. So part of the conventions of Asia. So, marami siyang pagpipilian doon sa mga na-suggest.
Oo nga, kasi talagang iba yung pinanggagalingan, even the assumptions about, the poet behind the text, no? Iba din yun, like deconstruction, tells us to veer away from the writer, from the author, whereas napaka-important naman yun siya sa Asia also.
Sa Asia,
Iba yung niya. Thank you. So, Vic Bautista, marami ka na dyang i-add sa iyong reading list. Topsy, meron ka bang like on language, specifically on language? Can you like give a suggestion?
Yes. Actually, sa mga those who are in language or in social linguistics, those who are enamored with language as communication issues, communicative language teaching, native speakerism, for example, go back to Noli. The questions of language and language teaching are already there in Noli. Jose Rizal, right? And those, yes, Noli Me Tangere. So those. Yes, because actually I just submitted one chapter recently that started with Noli, and basically said, social linguistics, sabi ko, 1960s na yung mga ideas na yun yung pinagyayabang natin, wala yan. Lumang-luma yan. So it's more like demystifying these like linguistic insights that entered, that discipline. Also talking about like the politics of knowledge production in linguistic ethnography, for example, Isabella de los Reyes, for example, can be a good start too. All right. So I am new to this as well. I think many of my friends are also new to this, and that's where our trajectories are going actually at this point, right? And I think these are what Philippine language scholars are doing, at least Philippine English language scholars are doing at this point, retracing historically the histories of ideas about language in the Philippines. Yeah.
Ganda no, history of ideas of language embedded not necessarily in what we think are like critical theories, but in our very own literary texts, no?
Yeah.
Thank you very much. So bitin pero 2 hours na. Okay, bitin, but thank you very much. Who says, thank you. This was such a great conversation with reading lists daw. Sabi ng isa.
Reading list.
Thank you daw. So, thank you very much. Thank you very much sa ating mga participants. Napaka-eager participants. Sobra silang excited dyan. And salamat talaga, Topsy, Carol, Ma'am Lily Rose. You've continued to inspire us to imagine and reimagine our critical practice in the Philippines. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Maraming salamat. May part 2 pa. So, bigay ko kayo. Let me call on Aaron. Aaron will have to close the webinar. Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Pison, and for moderating the roundtable discussion. And on behalf of everyone here in the webinar, we'd like to thank again our discussants, Professor Caroline Hau, Professor Lily Rose Tope, and Professor Ruanni Tupas for being with us this afternoon. And we would like to thank from the DECL, big thanks to our audience, our participants as well for this webinar. This is only the second webinar in our series of roundtable discussions in celebrating the department's 111th anniversary. So we have 2 roundtables left, and you may follow us on our Facebook and Twitter accounts for updates. But for now, that's it. Thank you. Keep safe and stay healthy, and we'll see you in the next webinar. Salamat.
Thank you.
Salamat.